Ma'am, I've asked you twice now. This isn't a waiting room.
I'm not waiting for anything. I'm just resting my legs.
She's not waiting. She's my customer. And you're going to speak to her like she is.
Baby, what's your mother's name?
11 Tuesdays. That is the part almost nobody noticed, and it is the part that ends up mattering most. For 11 Tuesdays in a row, the same elderly woman walked into that store a little after 2 in the afternoon, took the same chair near the fitting rooms, and sat with her handbag resting on her lap. She never tried anything on. She never asked what something cost. She never bought a single item in 11 weeks. And not one receipt in that building ever carried her name. The staff decided she was a woman with nowhere else to be. They were wrong about that, the way they were wrong about everything else concerning her. Simone Reddick made $14.10 an hour on that sales floor. Her son Micah was 4 years old, and his inhaler carried a copay of $42 that she paid every 6 weeks, whether or not the rest of the month allowed it. She had 2 written warnings sitting in a file in the back office, and she knew exactly what a third one meant, because she had watched it happen to a girl named Deborah in March. Simone was not a woman who spoke up. She had spent 3 years learning how to keep her face still. On the afternoon of June 3rd, she had every reason in the world to keep it still one more time. She did not. And here is what Simone Reddick did not know while she was crossing that floor. She had grown up in a house where one name explained everything that had gone wrong. She heard it at her aunt's kitchen table. She heard it at the repast after her mother's funeral, spoken low over foil pans of chicken. She heard it whenever the power got cut. It was the name of the woman sitting in that chair, and Simone would not learn that for another 9 days. There are 3 things worth holding on to before this goes any further, because each of them looks like one thing at the start of this story and something else entirely by the end. The first is what actually happened between Josephine Hale and Rochelle Reddick in the fall of 2001, because the version Simone grew up with and the version written down on paper do not match, and only one of them was ever spoken out loud in that family. The second is why a 74-year-old woman with a house on Sardis Road and a name on a warehouse off North Tryon spent 11 consecutive Tuesday afternoons sitting in a chair at a boutique she had no intention of buying anything from. When Simone Reddick finally stood in Josephine Hale's front room and asked her directly, the old woman did not deny anything. She did not soften it. She said 7 words that Simone has repeated to herself almost every day since. Your mother asked me not to tell you. Now, here is the honest promise this story makes. By the time it is finished, you will have made up your mind about Josephine Hale twice. Once early and once late. And one of those judgments is going to be wrong. This is not a story about a wealthy woman and a poor one. It is a story about a debt that was paid in the wrong direction for 24 years, and about what happens when the person carrying it dies before anyone thinks to correct the record. In 1999, Rochelle Reddick was 29 years old, and she was good at her job. She kept the books at Hale Provisions, a restaurant supply company operating out of a low brick warehouse off North Tryon, and she was the kind of employee that small businesses build themselves around without ever saying so out loud. She caught errors nobody else caught. She remembered which drivers had sick mothers and which ones were lying about it. Carl Hale, who owned the company and ran it the way men of his generation ran things, did not hand out compliments, but he handed Rochelle the Friday deposit bag, and in that building, everybody understood what that meant. She wore a good wool coat to work, navy, bought on layaway from a store on Independence. She was going somewhere. Everyone who knew her then says the same sentence in slightly different words. Rochelle was on her way up. Simone was born in March of that year, 7 weeks early, 3 pounds and 11 ounces. She spent 41 days in the neonatal intensive care unit at a hospital on Blythe Boulevard, and Rochelle spent 41 nights in a vinyl chair beside the incubator. The insurance Hale provisions carried covered a portion of it, not the portion that mattered. When the accounting finished, Rochelle Reddick owed a number that a bookkeeper making $31,000 a year could not pay, and she did the responsible thing. She signed a payment plan. She made the payments for 11 months. Then the transmission went out on her car, and she missed 1, and then she missed 3, and by the summer of 2001, the hospital had turned the balance over to a collections attorney who was preparing to seek a judgment against her. That is the part of the story her family never knew, because Rochelle never told them. What her family knew is what came next, and what came next arrived in November of 2001, when Rochelle Reddick walked out of that warehouse for the last time and never worked in an office again. The way Aunt Pearl told it, at her kitchen table in West Charlotte, over decades and dozens of retellings, the story was simple and it was cruel. The Hale woman called your mother a thief, called her that in front of the whole floor, and then made sure that word followed her to every job she applied for in this city. Pearl always ended it the same way. She said it like a verdict. They took your mama's name from her, and whatever the truth turned out to be, that part was not wrong. Rochelle Reddick applied for 11 bookkeeping and clerical positions between December of 2001 and the following August. She was interviewed 4 times. She was hired none of them. By 2004, she was cleaning houses in Myers Park and Eastover, 34 years old, riding 2 buses each way, and she was doing it in the same navy coat. By 2014, she was working days at a nursing facility and nights stocking shelves, and the coat was gone. She died in 2021 at 51 years old, of a heart that had been asked to do too much for too long, and at the repast at Greater Zion Missionary Baptist, over foil pans and sweet tea, somebody said the Hale name again, and 22-year-old Simone heard it the way she had always heard it, as the reason. 26 years old, and Simone Reddick had built her whole working life around not being noticed. She sold $400 cashmere at a boutique called Orel in SouthPark. In the black dress code she bought second-hand because the store did not provide it. She had learned which of Bridget Calloway's moods required an apology and which ones required silence. She had learned to eat lunch in her car. Her co-worker Tanya Pruitt had learned the same things, and the two of them had an understanding that neither had ever spoken aloud, which was that you do not put your name on anything. Micah's daycare closed at 6 and charged $1 a minute after. 2 written warnings. 1 child, no cushion, no savings, no second income, and no family left to fall back on. That is who was standing at Register 2 on the afternoon of June 3rd, which is why what happened next made no sense to anyone who worked there. She had first come in on a Tuesday in the middle of March. Nobody logged it because there is no reason to log a woman walking into a store. She was in her 70s, dressed carefully in the way that women of a certain generation dress to go anywhere at all, and she carried a leather handbag that had been expensive 15 years earlier and had been maintained since. She walked the floor once, then she sat down in the upholstered chair near the fitting rooms, and she stayed for a little under an hour, and then she left. She did it again the next Tuesday, and the next. By the 5th week, the staff had a name for her, the way retail staff always do, and the name was the window shopper. By the 8th week, Bridget Calloway had started noting the time she arrived. Bridget was 31, and she managed that floor the way she had been taught to manage it, which was by protecting what she called the environment. She had a phrase she used about customers who did not fit, and the phrase was, "our clientele." She had used it about a woman with a stroller in April. She had used it about 2 teenage girls in May. And on Tuesday, June 3rd, at approximately 2:40 in the afternoon, she walked over to the chair by the fitting rooms and asked Josephine Hale, politely, whether there was something she could help her find. Josephine said, "No thank you." She was resting. Bridget said, "Of course." 11 minutes later she came back and asked again, and this time she did not phrase it as a question. It did not happen all at once. That is what people misunderstand about this kind of thing, and it is why the staff who watched it happen took so long to recognize what they were watching. There was no shouting. Bridget's voice never rose above the level of ordinary conversation. She said that the chair was intended for customers who were trying on merchandise. She said that management had received feedback about the fitting room area. She said the words, "our clientele," and she said them while looking directly at the woman in the chair, and everyone on that floor understood the sentence underneath the sentence. She gestured toward the entrance. She mentioned, without any particular emphasis, that she could have someone from security walk her out if she needed assistance. And then she waited. Josephine Hale stood up. It took her a moment, because standing had become something she did in stages, and her hand went to the back of the chair to steady herself, and she stood there in the middle of that floor with 11 people looking at her and nowhere to put her eyes. Tanya Pruitt was folding a sweater at the display table 9 feet away. She folded that same sweater 4 times. She has said since that she does not have a good explanation for why she did not move, only that she has thought about it every day since, and that the honest answer is she needed the job. Simone Reddick was at register 2, and she did the arithmetic in about a second and a half, because it was arithmetic she had done many times. 2 written warnings. A third one meant termination, and termination meant no daycare deposit in July, and it meant asking Micah's pediatrician for samples again. She knew all of that. She crossed the floor anyway. And she did not do it because she was brave, and she has been clear about that every time she has been asked. She did it because she had spent her childhood in rooms where her mother was spoken to in exactly that tone of voice, by exactly that kind of pleasant, unhurried, reasonable cruelty, and she was old enough by then to have memorized the sound of it. What she said took about 9 seconds. She said the woman was not loitering, she was her customer, and she would be spoken to accordingly. Then she turned to Josephine Hale and asked if she could get her a glass of water. And the old woman looked up at this young cashier she had been watching for 11 weeks and asked her one question. She asked what her mother's name was. Simone answered. Josephine Hale sat back down and said nothing else, and left 20 minutes later without another word. She did not come back the following Tuesday, and on Thursday afternoon, Simone Reddick was fired. The paperwork said pattern of conduct inconsistent with company standards, which is a sentence constructed specifically so that it cannot be argued with. Bridget Calloway did not mention the incident on the floor. She mentioned the 2 prior warnings, one for a cash drawer that came up $9 short in January, and one for arriving 14 minutes late in April, and she said that the company had documented a pattern, and she slid the form across the desk. Simone signed it. She did not argue, because arguing gets you walked out by security instead of walking out yourself, and there is a difference, and the difference is the only thing you get to keep. She carried a canvas bag with her name tag and a spare pair of flats through the parking deck at 4 in the afternoon, and she sat in her car for a while before she started it, because she did not yet know how to tell a 4-year-old that things were about to change. And before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her final check cleared on the 9th. It covered June rent and left $160, and Micah's inhaler was due, and that is the arithmetic that sent Simone Reddick to a storage facility off Wilkinson Boulevard on the morning of June 12th. She was not looking for the truth about anything. She was looking for her mother's old life insurance paperwork, because Pearl had once said something about a small policy through the nursing facility, and Simone had never followed up on it, the way you never follow up on things in the year after a funeral. Unit 211. $41 a month she had been paying for 4 years to store a bed frame, a box of photographs, and a green plastic tub with a cracked lid. There was no life insurance policy. What was in the tub was the paper record of a woman's working life, kept for reasons Simone did not understand until she was most of the way through it. Pay stubs from Hale Provisions held together with a rubber band that broke when she touched it. A garnishment notice from a collections attorney dated August 2001 seeking judgment on a hospital balance of $6,418. A church program from a funeral in 2007, a photograph of Rochelle at 29 in the navy coat, and underneath all of it, folded into thirds, a single sheet of Hale Provisions letterhead dated the 16th of November, 2001. Simone read it 4 times in that storage unit, sitting on the concrete floor, and what she could not get past was everything the letter did not say. It did not say theft. It did not say misconduct. It did not reference a police report, or an investigation, or a company policy, because there was no accusation anywhere on it. It was a separation agreement. It stated that the employment relationship was concluded by mutual agreement effective that date, that no adverse statement would be entered into the personnel file, and that the employee would receive a severance payment of 3 months' salary. 3 months for a bookkeeper caught stealing. That number made no sense in any version of the story Simone had ever been told, and she sat there on that floor with it until her legs went numb. And then she looked at the signature line. It was not signed by Carl Hale. It was signed J. Hale. That is the 9th day. That is the moment Simone Reddick learned that the woman she had defended on a sales floor and lost her job for was the woman whose name had explained every hard thing that ever happened to her family. She drove to West Charlotte that afternoon with the letter in her hand and put it on Pearl's kitchen table, the same table where she had heard the story 100 times, and she watched her aunt look at it and then look away from it. Pearl did not read it. Pearl said she did not need to read it. And when Simone pushed, when she asked how a woman fired for stealing walks out with 3 months' pay and a clean file, Pearl folded her hands and said the only thing she would say on the subject, then or since. Some things your mama decided you didn't need. Simone left the letter on the table and drove to Sardis Road that night. The house was smaller than she expected. That is the first thing Simone noticed, and it mattered more than it should have, because she had spent 26 years imagining the Hale family from the outside. It was a brick ranch on a half-acre with a magnolia in the front yard and a wheelchair ramp built over the front steps, and the ramp was new. The woman who answered the door was 38 years old, in a blazer, holding a phone against her chest, and she introduced herself as Adrienne Hale and made it immediately clear that this was not a good time. Adrienne was Josephine's granddaughter, the daughter of Everett Hale, who had died in 2019. She was an estate attorney. She had been managing her grandmother's affairs for 2 years, and she stood in that doorway the way people stand when they have something to protect. And Simone read that posture the way anyone would have read it. She read it as guilt. Josephine Hale was in the front room in a hospital bed that had been brought into a house that had never had one. Hospice had started in April. She had a folder of pancreatic cancer paperwork on the side table and 11 weeks of Tuesdays behind her and, as it turned out, about 90 days left. She recognized Simone immediately. She asked Adrian to leave them, and Adrian refused, and Josephine repeated it, and Adrian left. Simone put the letter on the blanket. She asked one question: "Did you do it?" And here is what the old woman did not do. She did not deny it, she did not explain, she did not reach for context or circumstance or the passage of time. She said yes. She said she was the one who ended Rochelle Reddick's employment at Hale Provisions in November of 2001. She said she signed that agreement herself, in that room, at that desk, by the window. She said she knew what it would cost, and she said it in the flat voice of a woman who had rehearsed the sentence for a very long time and had stopped hoping anyone would come to hear it. So Simone said the thing. She said it standing up, and she said it loud enough that Adrian heard it from the kitchen. She said, "You took 20 years off my mother's life. She cleaned other people's houses. She rode 2 buses. She worked 2 jobs until her heart gave out at 51 years old, and she died with people still calling her a thief. And you sat in a store and watched me for 11 weeks like I was something you were shopping for." Josephine Hale let all of it land. She did not interrupt once, and when Simone finished, the old woman said the 7 words. She said, "Your mother asked me not to tell you." And then she said, "But Rochelle's been gone 4 years now, and I'm going next, and there's nobody left who can be hurt by it except you." She lifted one hand about 2 inches off the blanket and pointed at the bureau against the wall. She asked Simone to open the top drawer. What was in that drawer was not a check. It was a savings passbook, and the name printed on the front of it was Rochelle Reddick. On Friday, October 12, 2001, Rochelle Reddick took $4,200 out of the Hale Provisions deposit bag before it reached the bank. She did not gamble it, and she did not spend it on herself. She walked it into the office of a collections attorney on East 4th Street, and she paid off the hospital balance that had been sitting on her since the day her daughter was born 7 weeks early, because the judgment hearing was scheduled for the following month, and a judgment on the record of a 29-year-old single mother in 2001 meant wage garnishment, and wage garnishment at her salary meant she would lose the apartment. She intended to replace it over 4 Fridays. She got through 1. Carl Hale ran the October inventory reconciliation on the 22nd and found the shortfall, and by that evening he was on the phone with a lawyer about pressing charges, because Carl Hale was a man who believed in consequences and had never once in his life needed $4,000. Josephine got to the ledger before he did. She was not an owner of that company, and she was not an officer of it, but she had done the books for 8 years before they could afford to hire someone to do them, and she still knew the system better than her husband did. She recorded the $4,200 as a spoilage and damage write-down against the third quarter inventory, which was a category Carl never audited because it embarrassed him. She wrote a check out of the household account in her own name and deposited it into the business the following Monday. She drafted the separation agreement herself. She gave Rochelle 3 months' salary and a clean personnel file, and she told her to be gone by the 16th. And Carl Hale went to his grave in 2011, believing the numbers had simply been off. But this is the part that keeps it from being a rescue, and it needs to be said plainly, because Josephine Hale never once pretended otherwise. She saved Rochelle Reddick from a criminal charge, and she left her standing in the middle of a rumor. There were 19 people working in that warehouse, and every one of them watched the bookkeeper clean out her desk in November, and the story they built to explain it was the obvious one, and Josephine never corrected it. She could not correct it, because correcting it meant telling Carl what she had done with $4,200 of their household money, and she was not willing to do that. So the word followed Rochelle. It followed her through 11 applications and 4 interviews and into the houses in Myers Park, where she scrubbed floors in her 30s, and it was still following her at Greater Zion in 2021, when a room full of people said the Hale name over foil pans. Josephine kept her out of a courtroom and left her in the shadow of it for 20 years. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the passbook in that drawer, opened in 2003, deposited into every month for 18 years, and never once touched, does not cancel either one of them. Rochelle wrote to her once, one letter, in November of 2020, from a hospital bed on the same campus where Simone had been born. It did not ask for money, and it did not offer forgiveness. It asked Josephine, if she was still living when the time came, to find Simone and tell her the truth. But it set a condition, and the condition is the reason for the 11 Tuesdays. Rochelle wrote that she did not want her daughter carrying the knowledge unless she had turned into the kind of person who would do something with it. So a dying woman sat in a chair by the fitting rooms week after week, watching a cashier she had never met, waiting to find out who she was. And she never planned to be humiliated on that floor. Bridget Calloway did that entirely on her own. Which means the test Simone Reddick passed that afternoon was never supposed to be that hard. Josephine Hale died on the 18th of September. The estate distributed $4,200 to Simone Reddick, the exact figure, and not $1 more, because Josephine had been specific that it was a return and not a gift. What Adrian Hale sent with it mattered more. She filed an amended separation record for Rochelle Reddick with the North Carolina Department of Labor, 24 years after the fact, formally stating that the employee had left Hale provisions in good standing with no adverse finding of any kind. Simone framed that one, not the check. It hangs in a hallway in an apartment in West Charlotte where a 5-year-old boy walks past it every day without knowing what it is yet. So here is the question this leaves, and it is a real one. Was Josephine Hale a good woman? Or was she a woman who did the very least she could get away with, and got 24 years to feel decent about it?